December 19, 1944. The Ardennes forest lay wrapped in a shroud of mist and snow, the kind that muffled sound and blurred sight until the world itself seemed uncertain. In a small Belgian town named Bastogne, church bells stood silent, their iron throats frozen against the biting winter air. Civilians huddled in cellars, hearing the distant rumble of artillery that rolled like thunder through the earth. Above ground, soldiers of the 101st Airborne moved quietly along cobblestone streets, their breath forming fleeting ghosts in the dawn. They carried no illusions. The German army was closing in from all sides. Imagine being one of them. Your boots soaked through with meltwater, your stomach gnawing with hunger, your rifle cold enough to burn your fingers. You know the roads out are cut, the encirclement nearly complete. The radio crackles with fragmented messages confirming what you feared. You are surrounded. The Wehrmacht, in its last great gamble, has thrown 6 armored divisions against the thin American lines. And you, along with 10,000 others, are trapped in a town that has suddenly become the hinge of the war in the West. But what if I told you that in this moment of near hopelessness, the American soldiers of Bastogne would stand firm against overwhelming odds? What if I told you that their defiance, not just in battle but in spirit, would echo across generations as a lesson in resilience, courage, and unity? The Germans expected panic. Instead, they met defiance. They expected a collapse. Instead, they met the unbreakable will of men who knew they were the last thin wall between Hitler's desperate offensive and the open road to Antwerp. This is not simply a tale of tactics and weapons. It is a story of frostbitten hands gripping rifles, of medics performing surgeries in candlelit cellars, of officers scribbling orders by lantern light while shells shook the ground above. It is about ordinary men asked to do something extraordinary, to hold the line when all logic said it was impossible. And as we unravel this story, the siege, the suffering, the resolve, and the relief, we will discover why Bastogne became more than just a dot on the map. It became a symbol. So, if you're ready to journey back into that frozen pocket of history, to stand shoulder to shoulder with the men who would not yield, then stay with me until the very end. And before we step fully into the snows of 1944, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and ring the bell so you never miss these forgotten stories of World War II. Every click helps keep these memories alive, and ensures that the voices of the past continue to speak to us today. Now, let's enter Bastogne. The story of Bastogne cannot be told without first understanding the storm that birthed it. In December 1944, the world thought the war in Europe was nearly won. Allied armies had broken out of Normandy, liberated Paris, and pushed across France with stunning speed. By autumn, they stood along the German frontier, convinced the Reich was crumbling. Letters home promised the boys would be back by Christmas. Factories slowed production, families dared to exhale. But behind the curtains of secrecy, Adolf Hitler was preparing a final, desperate stroke. He believed he could split the British and American alliance, capture Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. The plan demanded speed, surprise, and above all, a blow struck through the Ardennes, that same forest where, in 1940, his panzers had stunned the world by breaking through. This time, however, the situation was reversed. Germany was battered, its fuel reserves dwindling, its armies mauled. Yet in the first hours of December 16, 1944, as fog rolled through the pines, more than 200,000 German troops and 1,000 tanks surged forward in what would be called the Battle of the Bulge. Caught in the path of this onslaught were green divisions of the U.S. Army. Men barely tested in battle suddenly found themselves overwhelmed. Villages fell, crossroads were seized, American units scattered in confusion. But amid the chaos, one location quickly became the focal point: the Belgian town of Bastogne. Why Bastogne? At first glance, it seemed an unremarkable place, a modest market town with a church spire, narrow streets, and farms stretching into the snow. But Bastogne was more than a dot on the map. It was the hub of 7 major roads. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled the arteries of the Ardennes. For the Germans to drive toward Antwerp, they needed those roads clear. For the Allies, holding Bastogne meant choking the offensive before it could reach full strength. The task of defending it fell to the 101st Airborne Division, the famed Screaming Eagles, along with elements of the 10th Armored Division. They were rushed forward in trucks, bouncing over icy roads, their breath visible in the frigid air. Many had little more than their summer uniforms. Supplies were thin, artillery short. Yet orders were clear: Hold Bastogne at all costs. On December 19, the trap began to close. German armored spearheads swung around the town, cutting every road, every lifeline. Suddenly Bastogne was surrounded. 10,000 Americans faced perhaps 4 times their number of Germans, including the battle-hardened Panzer Division and elite Volksgrenadiers. From that moment the defenders lived under constant bombardment. Shells screamed through the air, demolishing houses, setting barns ablaze, splintering trees into deadly shards. Imagine the scene: snow drifting into craters still steaming from explosions, the acrid scent of cordite mixing with the sickly sweetness of smoke from burning hay. Soldiers crouched in foxholes dug into frozen soil, their feet numb, their bodies shivering. In the town, civilians crowded into basements, clutching rosaries as the ground shook with each detonation. Doctors worked in improvised hospitals where the only anesthesia was a shot of whiskey and the patient's own courage. And yet morale did not break. "We are surrounded," one paratrooper remarked dryly. "That simplifies the problem." It was the kind of gallows humor that hid steel beneath. German commanders, confident that the Americans would surrender, sent envoys under a white flag on December 22. Their demand was simple: lay down arms to spare further bloodshed. The response came from Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st. His answer consisted of a single word, scribbled on a sheet of paper: nuts. The message was delivered to the Germans with polite explanation. It meant, go to hell. This defiance electrified the defenders. Bastogne would not yield. Every man knew now that their stand was not just tactical, it was symbolic. To surrender would open the road to the enemy. To resist meant giving time for General Patton's Third Army, wheeling north with desperate speed, to break through and relieve them. But Patton's relief was days away, and each day in Bastogne was an eternity. Food dwindled to handfuls of frozen bread and scraps of chocolate. Ammunition was counted bullet by bullet. Fuel for tanks and half-tracks ran low. Medical supplies were almost non-existent. Frostbite cases mounted. And still the Germans pressed harder. Christmas Eve descended with snow and silence between barrages. In one cellar, a chaplain led paratroopers in carols, their voices thin but steady. "It was the strangest Christmas I ever spent," one soldier wrote later, "but somehow the most meaningful." Outside, artillery flares lit the sky in shades of red and green, a grim imitation of holiday lights. Through it all, the men of Bastogne clung to the idea that help was coming. They could not know how close or how far. They only knew that every hour they held was another hour for the Allies to rally. This was Bastogne, a frozen island of resistance in a sea of steel and fire. By the 4th day of encirclement, the Germans had thrown wave after wave against Bastogne's perimeter. Each road leading into the town was tested. Tanks rumbled forward, their engines growling in the frozen night, only to be met with the bark of American 57mm anti-tank guns and the steady crack of rifles from foxholes dug into snowbanks. Mortar crews worked tirelessly, their tubes glowing from constant firing. Machine gunners, their fingers stiff from cold, fired short bursts, then huddled to warm their hands over tiny flames hidden in helmets. Every sector of the line had its story. At Neuville, just north of Bastogne, paratroopers from the 506th Infantry Regiment fought until their rifles overheated, trading ground inch by inch against German armor. At Marvy, to the southeast, men of the 327th Glider Infantry held against a determined push that threatened to break into the town itself. The fighting was close, brutal, and often at night, where shadows blurred friend and foe. But the Germans faced problems of their own. Their timetable demanded that Bastogne fall quickly, yet the stubborn defense bled them of time and strength. Roads clogged with traffic. Fuel shortages worsened. Every day Bastogne held was another day the offensive slowed, another chance for the Allies to regroup. And regroup they did. General George S. Patton, commanding the U.S. Third Army, had been preparing for a counteroffensive even as the German assault began. His ability to pivot entire corps on icy roads was nothing short of audacious. "I want my troops moving north and I want it now," Patton barked to his staff. The race was on. Could his tanks reach Bastogne before the defenders collapsed? Inside the town there was no time to ponder. Survival demanded every ounce of ingenuity. Ammunition boxes became makeshift tables. Helmets doubled as cooking pots. Soldiers scavenged whatever they could from abandoned homes. curtains for blankets, furniture for firewood. When rations failed, they boiled snow for water, chewing on anything edible to keep hunger at bay. The civilians of Bastogne shared in the ordeal. Entire families crowded into cellars with the paratroopers. Children learned to distinguish the whistle of incoming shells from the thunder of outgoing American artillery. Some carried buckets of snow into cellars for drinking water. Others volunteered to carry messages through the shattered streets. War had made them unwilling participants, yet their resilience mirrored that of the soldiers. Still the suffering grew. Casualties mounted. The main hospital, located in a convent, overflowed with wounded. Supplies ran out, forcing medics to perform amputations without anesthetic. The smell of blood mixed with candle wax, a scent survivors never forgot. One nurse later recalled, the moans were constant. But the men tried not to cry out. They didn't want to discourage the others. On Christmas morning, German artillery opened up with a barrage that seemed endless. Houses collapsed, barns caught fire, the very earth trembled. Yet through the smoke, American soldiers hung small scraps of tinsel or passed around pieces of hard candy saved from home. Faith and defiance mingled with despair. It was cold, it was hungry, it was hopeless, one paratrooper remembered, but it was ours and we weren't giving it up. That same day, Luftwaffe bombers flew over Bastogne, dropping explosives on the already battered town. Fires raged, lighting the night in hues of orange and red. But the weather, which had so far hampered Allied air support, began to clear. And with clear skies came salvation. The next morning, the unmistakable drone of C-47 transport planes filled the air. Paratroopers rushed from foxholes, waving at the sky as parachutes blossomed overhead. Supplies tumbled down, ammunition, food, medical kits, even blankets. It wasn't enough to eliminate suffering, but it was enough to rekindle hope. One soldier wrote, "When we saw those chutes, we knew we weren't forgotten." For the Germans, this was a turning point. Their grip was tightening, but they could feel it slipping. Every attempt to storm the town was met with stiff resistance. And the longer the battle dragged on, the more pressure mounted on their flanks from Allied counterattacks. The dream of reaching Antwerp began to fade in the snow outside Bastogne. The siege, however, was not yet broken. The defenders still had to endure another week of hell. Shells continued to rain down. Tanks pressed against the thin lines. The cold remained merciless. Yet the men of Bastogne dug in deeper, fought harder, and held their ground with a stubbornness that astonished even themselves. In moments of silence between barrages, many wondered, how much longer? How many more days until relief came, if it came at all? While the men inside Bastogne clung to survival, George Patton's Third Army was in motion. What he had promised Eisenhower in that smoky conference room, 3 divisions pivoting north within 48 hours, was now reality. The scale of the maneuver was staggering. 250,000 men, 133,000 vehicles, and thousands of tons of fuel and ammunition, all rerouted over icy, narrow roads already choked with retreating units and civilians. Patton was relentless. Orders snapped down the chain of command with precision. Fuel convoys rumbled forward in blackout conditions. Engineers worked day and night, clearing ice, building bridges, and stringing new telephone lines across miles of countryside. The logistical miracle was every bit as impressive as the combat to come. One staff officer later remarked, "The Germans thought weather and roads would save them. They never counted on Patton." At the spearhead was the 4th Armored Division, commanded by Major General Hugh Gaffey. Within it, the 37th Tank Battalion, led by the fiery Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, shouldered the task of breaking through. Abrams, later to become Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army, was known for leading from the front, and his men trusted him implicitly. "Follow Abe," they said, "and you'll get through." But progress was slow. Snowdrifts buried roads. Vehicles slid into ditches. Men marched until their boots froze to their feet. Enemy resistance was fierce. Every crossroads, every village was turned into a strong point. German artillery harassed every move, and snipers stalked columns from wooded ridges. In some places the advance was measured in yards, not miles. On December 22, as German envoys strode into Bastogne with their infamous surrender ultimatum, Abrams' tankers were still fighting bitter engagements south of the town. When McAuliffe's reply, that single word, "nuts," reached them, it spread like wildfire through the columns. Soldiers cheered. It wasn't just defiance, It was a promise. Bastogne would not fall before they arrived. Through December 23rd and 24th, the 4th Armored Division ground forward. At Chaumont, tanks of the 37th Battalion fought street to street against German panzers. At Martelange, engineers had to rebuild bridges under fire just to keep the advance moving. Casualties mounted. Sherman tanks burned on the roadside, their black smoke curling into the frozen sky. But the drive did not stop. The sudden break in weather on December 23 brought a new dimension: Allied air power. Fighter bombers of the 9th Air Force swept the skies, strafing and bombing German columns. C-47s dropped supplies into Bastogne, their parachutes drifting down like snowflakes. For the first time, Patton's advance and the defenders' desperate stand felt connected, two halves of a single battle converging. Christmas Eve was bitter. In Bastogne, bombs and shells turned the holy night into an inferno. Outside the town, Abrams' battalion pushed toward the village of Assenois, only a few miles away. The men were exhausted, hollow-eyed, and freezing, yet they pressed forward. One tanker recalled, "We had been told, get to Bastogne by Christmas. That was all we needed. We weren't going to fail them." By December 25th, the Americans inside Bastogne were hanging on by sheer willpower. Ammunition was scarce, rations nearly gone. McAuliffe issued a Christmas message to his troops, praising their defiance and reminding them of their duty. "We are giving our country and our loved ones at home a worthy Christmas present," he wrote. "We are continuing to hold Bastogne." That same morning, German forces launched one of their heaviest assaults. 18 tanks of the Panzer Division, supported by hundreds of infantry, smashed into the perimeter. The fighting was savage, but American tank destroyers and artillery tore into the attackers. By the afternoon, the snow was littered with burning wrecks. The line had held once more. Meanwhile, Abrams' tanks were closing in. On December 26 at 4:20 p.m., after days of grueling combat, his lead element stormed into Assenois. Artillery thundered in support as Shermans blasted their way through. Lieutenant Charles Boggis, commanding the tank Cobra King, was at the point. Through his periscope, he spotted American paratroopers of the 101st Airborne ahead, gaunt, weary figures waving from foxholes. At 4:50 p.m., Cobra King reached them. The siege of Bastogne had been broken. The moment was electric. Men who had endured 10 days of isolation wept openly as they greeted the tank crews. Some embraced, others fired rifles into the air in celebration. "We're glad to see you boys," McAuliffe told Abrams' men with his characteristic calm understatement. But every soldier knew it was more than relief. It was proof that they had not been abandoned, that the promise of hold until relieved had been kept. The corridor opened by Abrams was narrow, less than half a mile wide, and under constant German fire. But it was enough. Supplies and reinforcements began trickling into Bastogne, turning survival into victory. The German stranglehold was broken, their offensive fatally slowed. General Heinrich von Luttwitz, commander of the German corps encircling Bastogne, admitted later, "After the relief, we knew the operation had failed." Bastogne was the turning point. For Patton, the relief of Bastogne was both a triumph and a vindication. His gamble, his speed, and his audacity had paid off. For the men of the 101st Airborne, it was proof that their sacrifice had not been in vain. And for the Germans, it was the shattering of a myth. The myth that Americans were soft, unwilling to endure hardship. Bastogne showed the world otherwise. The relief of Bastogne did not end the battle. Far from it. The corridor opened by Abrams' tanks was fragile, barely wide enough for convoys, and constantly harassed by German artillery and counterattacks. Snow continued to fall, turning the roads into ice-slick ribbons. Every supply run into Bastogne became a gamble, every returning ambulance a race against death. Still, the psychological shift was undeniable. Where despair had lingered only days before, now there was determination. Bastogne would not fall. The defenders, bloodied and frostbitten, dug deeper. Reinforcements trickled in. Artillery ammunition arrived in precious crates. C-47s flew overhead again, dropping bundles that crashed into snowdrifts or snagged on shattered rooftops. Morale soared. For the Germans, the relief was a bitter blow. Their offensive, designed for speed and shock, was losing momentum. Fuel shortages crippled their panzers. Air superiority, briefly theirs thanks to the winter fog, now belonged once more to the Allies. Fighter bombers prowled the skies, hammering convoys and strafing roads. What had begun with the roar of 1,600 German guns on December 16 was now faltering under relentless American resistance. General Otto von Manschufel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army, later admitted, "We underestimated them. We thought they would break. Instead, they fought like wolves trapped in a cage." Inside Bastogne, the defenders earned that reputation daily. Medical stations overflowed with wounded, yet surgeons worked by candlelight, improvising with cognac when morphine ran out. Chaplains read prayers in frozen cellars, their voices muffled by artillery thunder. Civilians huddled beside soldiers, sharing cellars, sharing scraps of food and sharing fear. Bastogne was not just a military outpost anymore, it was a crucible of human endurance. The cost was staggering. Between December 19 and January 6, the 101st Airborne Division suffered over 2,500 casualties. The 10th Armored Division's Combat Command B lost hundreds more. The 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, with its fast and lethal M18 Hellcats, destroyed more than 100 German armored vehicles but paid with 17 of their own. Every name etched into casualty lists was a reminder of the battle's brutality. Yet against all odds the line held. And when the corridor widened, when food, ammunition and reinforcements finally flowed freely, the defenders of Bastogne stood taller. They had endured the worst and emerged unbroken. The larger German offensive was crumbling. Hitler's gamble, to split the Allies, seize Antwerp and force a negotiated peace, had failed. Bastogne was the hinge, the pivot point that turned the tide. Without it, German columns might have pressed deeper. With it, the offensive slowed, stalled and collapsed. The numbers tell the story. In 6 weeks of fighting, German forces lost between 81,000 and 98,000 men, more than 600 tanks and assault guns, and nearly 1,000 aircraft. These were losses the Reich could not replace. American casualties were also high, about 75,000 with 19,000 killed. But America could replace them. Fresh divisions were already arriving in Europe, one after another, like waves against a crumbling seawall. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, overall German commander in the West, summarized it bluntly after the war: "Bastogne was the graveyard of our hopes." For the Allies, the victory was more than tactical. It was symbolic. The word, nuts, became legend, a single syllable embodying defiance, courage, and the refusal to surrender. Patton's whirlwind maneuver was studied in military academies for generations to come. Eisenhower himself called the defense of Bastogne a shining example of American fighting spirit. And for the men who had lived it, for the paratroopers who dug frozen foxholes, for the tankers who braved icy roads, for the medics who patched shattered bodies, it was an experience they carried for the rest of their lives. In December 1984, veterans from both sides gathered in Bastogne for the 40th anniversary. Former foes shook hands, embraced and shared memories. General Anthony McAuliffe, then 87, spoke to the crowd. His words were simple yet powerful: "We fought here not for conquest but for freedom. We fought not from hatred but from duty." Hans Detmer, who had once marched into Belgium with the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, echoed the sentiment. "In 1944 I came as a conqueror. Today I return as a friend." The Americans showed us then what democracy truly means, not weakness but strength. Today, Bastogne bears little resemblance to the shattered town of 1944. Children climb on the preserved Sherman tank in the town square. The Martison Memorial stands on a hill, a massive star-shaped monument inscribed with the names of American states whose sons fought there. And every December 16th at 5:30 a.m., the bells ring across the town, marking the exact moment the German offensive began. There is even a small foxhole preserved in the woods nearby, just a hole in the frozen earth lined with rotting logs. Yet for those who kneel beside it, who place their hands on its icy edge, it speaks louder than any monument. Here, young men held against impossible odds. Here they proved that freedom would not yield. The lessons of Bastogne are timeless. That determination can outweigh numbers. That preparation and audacity can rewrite the rules of war. That free men, fighting for each other and for principle, can endure what no enemy expects. Perhaps the last word belongs to Winston Churchill. Addressing the British Parliament in January 1945, he declared, "This is undoubtedly the greatest American battle of the war, and will, I believe, be regarded as an ever-famous American victory." He was right. Bastogne was not just a battle. It was a turning point. It was proof that when democracy is cornered, it fights with a ferocity tyrants can never match. For General Georges Patton, Bastogne was more than a battlefield, it was a stage where his audacity reshaped history. Even before the German offensive began, he had anticipated such a move. In early December, during a conference at Verdun, he warned Eisenhower's staff, "The Kraut is desperate. He'll strike where we least expect him." When the Bulge erupted days later, Patton was not caught flat-footed. His Third Army was already poised to pivot. In what remains one of the most extraordinary feats of logistics in military history, he turned an entire army, 250,000 men, 1,000 tanks, 11 divisions, northward in less than 72 hours. Military historians often describe it as equivalent to rotating a skyscraper on its foundation while keeping all the lights on and the elevators running. On December 22, while McAuliffe sent his "nuts" reply in Bastogne, Patton's armored columns were rumbling forward, engines echoing across snowbound roads. They moved through blizzards, through villages clogged with refugees, through crossroads hammered by Luftwaffe strafing runs. Soldiers wrapped rags around their boots, their breath freezing on rifles, their eyes hollow with fatigue. Yet they kept moving. Orders were blunt: get to Bastogne. When the 4th Armored Division punched through on December 26, it was the culmination of Patton's gamble. Bastogne was relieved, but the broader significance was even greater. The German offensive was broken. Momentum had shifted permanently to the Allies. Patton later reflected in his diary, "In future years, men will speak of Bastogne as they speak of Thermopylae. Outnumbered, surrounded, freezing, starving, yet they held. And because they held, we could strike." Indeed, Bastogne gave the Allies an anchor in the Ardennes. From this pivot, they launched counterattacks that drove the Germans back across the rivers and forests they had so recently crossed. The salient, that great bulge on the map that had threatened to split the Allied armies, shrank day by day under relentless pressure. For Germany, the defeat was catastrophic. Not only had they squandered precious reserves of fuel, tanks, and men, but they had also revealed to the world that the Reich was no longer capable of decisive offense. From January 1945 onward, the Wehrmacht fought a defensive war on both fronts. The dream of forcing the Allies to the negotiating table was dead. Inside the Reich, whispers of despair spread. Diaries from German civilians revealed the mood. On January 1, a Berlin resident wrote, "They told us the Ardennes offensive would bring victory. Now we hear only of retreats, of losses, of the Americans stronger than ever. Hope fades." On the Allied side, the victory at Bastogne, and the broader failure of the Bulge, stiffened resolve. Eisenhower told his staff, "The Germans have shot their bolt. The end is only a matter of time." British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, never one to miss a rhetorical flourish, declared before Parliament, "The Battle of the Ardennes is the greatest American battle of the war. All honor to the troops who fought it." Patton's reputation soared. His maneuver to relieve Bastogne became a textbook example of operational brilliance. Military academies worldwide studied his ability to redirect entire formations under pressure, to coordinate armor, artillery, and infantry on the move, and to turn chaos into victory. Even his critics, and he had many, admitted that Bastogne was his finest hour. Yet Patton himself deflected glory. In a letter to his wife he wrote, "The men of the 101st are the heroes. They froze, they bled, they stood. We only opened the door. They kept the house." The story of Bastogne also reshaped American military doctrine. The experience demonstrated the necessity of rapid logistical flexibility, of combined arms cooperation, and of maintaining reserves capable of immediate counterstroke. These lessons would echo decades later in conflicts from Korea to Iraq. But beyond doctrine, Bastogne entered the American imagination as a symbol of grit. Journalists carried the story home. Headlines shouted, "Nuts to the Germans." Hollywood would eventually bring it to the screen in films like Battleground 1949 and Band of Brothers half a century later. For ordinary Americans, Bastogne became proof that their soldiers, citizen soldiers drawn from farms and factories, could endure the harshest test and prevail. For the men who had lived through it, the memories were sharper than any movie. Private Edward Shames of Easy Company recalled, "We had no blankets, no winter clothes, no food. Frostbite was eating our toes. The shells never stopped. But no one talked of quitting. You clung to the man next to you and you fought. Corporal Lester Heine of the 4th Armored Division remembered the moment they broke through. We saw paratroopers waving from the edge of town, filthy, unshaven, grinning like madmen. They looked like they had been through hell. And maybe they had. But they were still there. And so Bastogne became not just a place on a map, but a legend. The stand in the snow, the town that would not fall, the battle that proved once and for all that American resolve could not be broken. The guns finally fell silent in Bastogne in early January 1945. Snow still blanketed the fields, now churned with wreckage, burned-out tanks, shattered farmhouses, twisted telephone poles hanging limp with wires. The smell of cordite lingered, mixed with the acrid smoke of destroyed fuel and the faint sweetness of pine burned as firewood in foxholes. Survivors walked through the town in a daze. Some paratroopers staggered into cafes long since gutted, staring at the walls as if unsure whether the ordeal had truly ended. Relief did not come in the form of rest. For the men of the 101st and their rescuers in the 4th Armored Division, there were no long pauses. Orders soon pushed them eastward, to pursue retreating German forces and prevent another foothold from forming. Yet for a brief moment the men of Bastogne breathed, and in that breath they realized they had endured one of the fiercest sieges of the modern era. Medical officers recorded chilling statistics. In some units, nearly a third of the soldiers suffered frostbite injuries. Hospitals behind the lines overflowed not just with gunshot wounds but with men whose feet had turned black, whose fingers had frozen stiff. Doctors amputated quietly, sometimes by candlelight, knowing supplies were too short for proper anesthetics. The winter of 1944 had been one of Europe's coldest in decades, and the soldiers had fought it as fiercely as they had fought the Germans. Yet the psychological toll was perhaps greater still. Letters home reveal men groping for words. One private wrote, "I can't tell you what it was like. Imagine hell frozen over, then imagine you cannot leave. That is Bastogne." Another described the silence after the shelling ceased. "We sat and listened. Nothing. After days of thunder, nothing. It felt stranger than the noise." For the Germans, the aftermath was catastrophic. Hitler had poured his last strategic reserves into the Ardennes, gambling that a dramatic strike would shatter Allied morale. Instead, the failure at Bastogne exposed his army's weakness to the world. Panzer divisions that had once spearheaded lightning victories were now reduced to skeleton formations. Fuel shortages crippled mobility. Infantry marched on frostbitten feet without air cover as Allied planes, once grounded by weather, now roared overhead with vengeance. Captured diaries from German soldiers tell a story of despair. One entry from a soldier in the 26th Volksgrenadier Division read, "We were promised surprise, momentum, and fuel. We found only hunger, mud, and the enemy everywhere. The Führer dreams but we die." Strategically, Bastogne and the Bulge sealed Germany's fate. The Eastern Front was collapsing under the Red Army's January offensive, Operation Vistula Oder, which stormed across Poland and reached within 70 kilometers of Berlin. In the West, the Allies no longer feared a split. Instead, they pressed forward with renewed confidence, knowing the Wehrmacht had spent its last reserves. But even as military analysts tallied gains and losses, the story of Bastogne was already being mythologized. War correspondents had filed dispatches from the front, describing the siege in stark detail. Photographs of ragged paratroopers trudging through snow appeared in American newspapers. The phrase, "nuts," circulated rapidly, becoming a symbol of American defiance. For families anxiously reading headlines back home, Bastogne became proof that their sons could withstand anything. President Franklin Roosevelt, though gravely ill by this stage of the war, followed the reports closely. In a message to Congress, he invoked Bastogne as an example of undaunted courage under fire, the kind of courage that wins wars and preserves liberty. Churchill, too, seized on the symbolism, telling the House of Commons that Bastogne would be remembered alongside Britain's own moments of national endurance, like Dunkirk and the Battle of Britain. After the war, Bastogne became a place of pilgrimage. Veterans returned, some in uniform, some in civilian clothes, to walk the ground where they had nearly died. Local civilians, too, remembered. The people of Bastogne had suffered terribly during the siege. Homes destroyed, families displaced, food seized by both armies. Yet they never forgot the American defense that had prevented their town from being permanently occupied. Children who had grown up hiding in basements later guided tours for visiting soldiers, pointing to shell craters that still scarred their fields. Commemoration took many forms. In 1950, the Martyson Memorial was inaugurated on a hill overlooking the town, shaped as a five-pointed star, inscribed with the names of all 50 American states. Beneath it lies a crypt, with altars donated by Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish communities, symbolizing the unity of faiths and honoring sacrifice. Veterans who returned often stood silently beneath its stone arches, tracing their hands over the carved words. The legacy of Bastogne also shaped military education. At West Point at the U.S. Army War College and in NATO training exercises, the siege is studied not just as a tactical episode, but as a case study in leadership, morale, and logistics under extreme pressure. McAuliffe's calm defiance, Patton's audacious maneuver, the paratroopers' stubborn resistance, all became lessons for future generations of officers. Yet perhaps the most enduring legacy was human. Bastogne proved that ordinary men, placed in extraordinary circumstances, could accomplish the impossible. These were not professional soldiers hardened from birth. Many were teenagers, clerks, farmers, students before the war. They endured because they had one another, because they trusted their leaders, because they believed that giving up was unthinkable. Sergeant Jake Larson later reflected, "We didn't think we were heroes. We were just trying to live to the next day." But history decided otherwise. For the Germans who fought at Bastogne, the memory was more complicated. Some admired the Americans' tenacity. A German officer captured after the battle reportedly told his interrogators, "You Americans fight like wolves. Even surrounded, even starving, you still bite." Others spoke only of bitterness, of promises made by their leaders that victory was certain, betrayed once again by reality. As the decades passed, the veterans grew older, but the story of Bastogne grew larger. Every anniversary brought ceremonies, wreaths, and moments of silence. Children of the 101st traveled with their fathers back to Belgium, walking the snowy fields together. Locals welcomed them as liberators, a bond unbroken by time. By the late 20th century, Bastogne had become not just a memory of war, but a bridge between nations. Belgians, Americans, and Germans alike came to the memorials, the former in gratitude, the latter in reconciliation. Where once tanks clashed and artillery thundered, tourists now walked quietly reading plaques, gazing at rusting helmets displayed in glass cases. The story of Bastogne thus moved beyond the war itself. It became a symbol of resilience, of unity against overwhelming odds, of the power of human spirit to withstand even the darkest winter. Today, when one walks through the quiet streets of Bastogne, it is hard to imagine the thunder of artillery that once shook these cobblestones. Shops now line the square where Sherman tanks once idled, and children play where foxholes once scarred the earth. Yet beneath the calm lies a memory preserved in monuments, in museums, and in the hearts of those who still whisper, "Nuts," with a smile of recognition. The story of Bastogne is more than just a chapter in World War II. It is a parable of endurance. Against snow, hunger, and encirclement, ordinary men stood firm. Against overwhelming firepower, they refused to surrender. And against the cold logic of military odds, they carved out victory through will alone. Why does Bastogne matter still, nearly 80 years later? Because it reminds us of the timeless truth that wars are not only decided by weapons or numbers, but by spirit. The Germans had superior tanks, carefully laid plans, and the element of surprise. Yet their assault faltered against men who would not bend. The lesson is clear. Determination can be as decisive as firepower. This lesson echoes into the modern age. Military strategists speak of network-centric warfare, precision-guided munitions, cyber operations. Yet beneath all the technology lies the same principle shown at Bastogne. Cohesion, morale, and resilience matter most. An army cut off, surrounded, and freezing can still prevail if it refuses to collapse. But the legacy of Bastogne is not only military. It is moral. The men who fought there believed they were part of something greater than themselves. The preservation of democracy, the liberation of Europe, the defense of freedom. They were far from home, many not yet 20 years old, yet they bore a burden that would shape the century. Their endurance bought time for the Allied advance, shortened the war, and saved countless lives. Bastogne also offers a lesson in leadership. General McAuliffe's single word, "nuts," became legendary not for its bravado alone, but for the clarity it provided. In the darkest hour, when confusion and fear could have reigned, he gave his men a symbol, something simple enough to repeat, to believe in, to rally around. Leadership, Bastogne teaches us, is not about speeches or strategies alone, but about embodying resolve when others falter. There is, too, a lesson about unity. The 101st Airborne did not hold Bastogne alone. Engineers, tank crews, medics, artillerymen, and even local civilians played their part. When the 4th Armored Division broke through, it was not just one unit saving another, but the combined strength of an army acting as one. The siege reminds us that no victory is ever won alone, not in war, not in life. As the veterans of Bastogne passed into history, they left behind more than medals and memoirs. They left a standard. In ceremonies, their voices grew softer with age, yet their message grew louder: stand firm, endure, and never yield when freedom is at stake. One paratrooper, returning to Bastogne in the 1970s, stood quietly before the Martyson Memorial. Asked what he felt, he answered simply, "I hear the silence of my friends who did not come home. They are the real story." His words remind us that behind every tale of heroism lies sacrifice, and behind every victory lies loss. Today, new generations walk the fields where the battle was fought. They see rusted helmets, preserved foxholes, and plaques written in many languages. They hear the stories from guides, from books, from documentaries. And they learn that Bastogne is not just about the past. It is about the present, and the choices each generation must make when tested. For in every era, there comes a winter of doubt, a moment when the odds seem overwhelming, when surrender seems easier than resistance. Bastogne teaches us to hold fast in those winters, to endure until relief comes, and to believe that even in darkness, light can return. When the bells ring in Bastogne each December, they do more than honor history. They call to us across time. They remind us that the stand in the snow was not only for 1944, but for every generation that seeks to live free. So, when we remember Bastogne, let us remember not only the tanks and maps, the strategies and orders. Let us remember the faces of young soldiers, their breath in the cold air, their laughter even amid terror, their courage in the face of despair. Let us remember that in one of the darkest winters of the 20th century, human will prove stronger than steel. And let us carry that lesson forward into our own lives, our own struggles, our own winters. For Bastogne is not only a place in Belgium. It is a symbol, a reminder, a beacon. It tells us that even when surrounded, even when weary, even when hope seems gone, we can endure. We can fight. We can prevail. That is the legacy of Bastogne. That is why the name echoes still across the decades, across the snow, across the silence of memory.